Hello guys, in this lesson we are going to learn about middleware or middleware functions in Express. This is a very important topic because most things Express are middleware. As we can see from the official documentation, it says that Express is a routing and middleware web framework. We are going to see this in the code, but first let me explain with this diagram. We have seen in the previous lesson the request, response cycle and route handler, where we send a request to a designated URL path, and then we have a route handler to handle that request and send the response to the client. For example, here in the code, I have this get request to localhost 3000/privacy policy. This is the path for the request. And then this callback function is the route handler, just a function where we can write our logic. At the end of the day, we just respond to the client, calling one of the functions that is inside the REST object. Now back to middleware function. A middleware function is a function that has access to the request object and the response object and can call the next middleware in the series of middlewares. That means for a given request response cycle, we can have no middleware at all. We can have multiple middlewares, right? And we say that that middleware has access to the request object, so it can modify the incoming request data. It can inspect it, whatever you want to do with it, just like we can do in the route handler. It can also terminate the request response cycle by calling one of the functions we have in the REST object, similar to what we saw in the route handler. Additionally, a middleware function can invoke the next middleware. If we have multiple middleware, when we call next, it means I'm handing over to whatever that comes after me, that is next middleware that comes after me, for it to execute. Take for example this auth middleware. It checks whether the user is authenticated. If the user is authenticated, it calls next and hand over to the next middleware, in this case the row middleware, that checks whether the user has the required row to access that route. If that is the case, it calls the next middleware, in this case the route handler. From the structure, you can already tell that the route handler is also a middleware, because we said that a middleware function is a function that has access to the request object, the response object, and can optionally invoke the next middleware function. So invoking the next middleware function is optional. What that means is, take for example this auth middleware. If the user is not authenticated, we don't want the request to proceed further, basically. What we can do is to call something like res.status 401.json, whatever. We just call a function of res to send a 401 unauthenticated response to the client saying that, hey, you are not authenticated, we cannot proceed further, thereby terminating the request response cycle. If, however, the user is authenticated, we call next so that the code execution proceeds further to the next middleware or down to the route handler. Similar thing for the row middleware. If the user has the required row, take for example, we are requiring the user to have admin row to access this route. If the user has the row, we call next. Otherwise, we say res.status 403, we send a response to the client, thereby terminating the request response cycle. As we can see from this official documentation, the characteristics of a middleware: it can execute any code. That means whatever code you write here is up to you, right? It can make changes to the request and response object. You have access to the object, so you do with them as you please. And then it can end the request response cycle, like we've explained with res. Sending a status code or whatever response to the client. If some conditions are not met here, the logic is up to you. And finally, you say it can call the next middleware in the series of middleware that we have for that route. For example, after auth middleware is executed, it calls next so that the next middleware, which is row middleware, is executed, it calls next, etc., etc. To better understand middleware, let's go ahead and implement what I have on the screen. That is the auth middleware and row middleware. Auth middleware, we check whether the user is authenticated, and row middleware, we check whether the user has the required row as we specify for that route. First, let me explain some changes from the previous lesson. So what I've done is to clean things up a little bit. In the users route, we had a number of routes here in the users route, but now we have only two. One to get all the users and another one to get user by the ID. And then I added one more route, which is auth route. This is for login. Please take note, we are not implementing the actual authentication or authorization. What I have is just a dummy helper function to simulate the process. We're not talking about this helper function really. It's just for us to return some fake data, some fake login, right? Just to simulate the process. Our focus is on middleware. Auth and user management, etc. can be for another lesson. So I have auth route and I have users route. Then in app.js, I imported those two routes and wired them up here. That means to access something like login, you can see that we already have the prefix slash, that is localhost 3000 /auth, and then /login. That is the URL you can see over here. Localhost 3000 is the base URL /auth /login. And similar thing for users, we have users route mounted here, mounted to this part /users. So localhost 3000 /users nothing, this is the base, will give us the list of all the users, and then to find one, we specify the ID, which corresponds to this route here. Let's go ahead and call these three routes, that is 2 in the users and 1 in auth, before we continue. So I will just call to get the list of users, send, you can see we get the list of all the users. I will try to find one user, we get one user, and if I go to login, we get an auth token. Remember that we are not implementing actual authentication or authorization, but we just have some helpers to simulate the process. But ideally, you don't want any user to get the list of the users in your application, right? Usually you want to protect some route by row, or you want to make sure that the user is authenticated before they can access anything at all. And that is the middleware we're about to implement. So how do we do this? For this, I'm going to create a folder. Let me call this middleware. Here, I'm going to have our auth middleware and row middleware. So let me start with auth middleware, auth.js. I'm going to export function. Let's just call it auth. Remember we said that a middleware has access to request object, the response object, and can call the next middleware. So this is an example of middleware, but inside here we don't have any logic yet. The logic for this auth middleware is to validate that the user is authenticated. If the user is authenticated, it is going to call next so that the request proceeds to the next middleware. Otherwise, we are going to terminate with a 401 response. One of the common ways that people check whether someone or the client is authenticated is by checking the auth token in the request. There are different ways to implement authentication, but let's just imagine that we have a JWT token issued to the user after login. This is our JWT token. We expect that for a protected route, let's assume the user's route, the user is going to supply that JWT in the header as authorization header. So here, authorization, and then the valid token. But when using something like Postman, it makes it even more convenient. You can go to Auth tab and select the type of token you are sending over. In this case, it is a bearer token. So you click this, and then here you supply your token. But we have not implemented the code. Let's go back to the code. So remember, we are not writing the logic for authentication. What I have done is to have this helper function just to simulate the process, nothing more than that. For that, I'm going to say const token to be equal to extract token, extract the bearer token from authorization header, auth request dot headers, dot authorization. That is the key for that header. And another thing I want to do is to extract information from that token. Let's assume that the user supplied a valid token in the authorization header, right? What we want to do is to validate the token, etc., etc. Oftentimes, we have additional information like user ID, something like that, encoded in that token. So the next thing here is, let me call it data, is equal to extract token data. And that should be the token. Then down here, I want to check if I don't get that data, it implies that the user did not supply any token or did not supply a valid token. In that case, what I want to do is to return a 401 response. So I can say res.status, just setting the status code to 401 instead of the default 200 status code. And then I want to send a JSON with a message that says message valid auth token required. If not, that is if the user is authenticated, if this condition is not met, it implies the user is authenticated. We just call next to hand over to the next middleware. Make sure to call next when you have not terminated the request response cycle so that the code execution will continue. Alright, we have an auth middleware now. How do we make use of it? Because right now, if I send this request without any token, I still get the response, right? No issue at all. To make use of the middleware, it's simple. I will go to the route I want to protect in this example. Let's take user's route. So I will go to route, user's route, and this is the guy I want to protect. We just specify that middleware like this. Make sure to import that. So I have it imported. Now, when a request comes to this part, that is localhost 3000/users, the functions, as the callback functions, are going to execute in order as we specify them. That means that the auth middleware function will execute before this route handler. This is just a function, right? Let's say const route handler, equal to that, and we copy this guy and paste here. It is the same thing. So we have a route, we have the path, and we have the functions we want to execute sequentially. If we do it this way, it means that this route handler will execute before the auth middleware. That is not what we want. So I'm just going to undo all these things. All right. Now let's go ahead and give this a try, trying to fetch a user, the list of users again. I will send the request. You can see we get the message, valid auth token required. And the status code is 401 according to our implementation. Not there. According to the implementation here. So what I want to do is to supply a valid auth token when making that request. For that, I'll go back to login. I'm going to copy this token and head over to auth tab. I select bearer token. Bearer token, that's the type of token we're expecting. And then I will paste the token. I will send the request again. You can see that because we supplied a valid token, I can access that route. Let me supply an invalid token. Of course, I cannot access the route. Talking about the middleware, the logic you write here is totally up to you. This is just for demonstration purposes, right? What you need to know is that you have access to these parameters, and then you can use them as you see fit. So the logic for your middleware is up to you. Talking about logic, what we can do is to attach a boolean that shows that the user is authenticated to the request object, so that anywhere else down the line, you can just check request.authenticated to know whether it is true or false. True means the user is authenticated. false means otherwise. We can do something like rec.authenticated to be equal to true. And then let me attach more information. Let's say request.auth data to be equal to this data. Anywhere down the line, I can access this information. For example, let me go over to here. Let me just do a console.log of authenticated. So we check request.authenticated. Similar thing for the auth data. Auth data. Say request.auth. I will save this and send the request again. You can see that the thing we attached to the request object here is accessible down the line. So let me head over to Postman and send the request. Then we look at the console. You can see that we have authenticated true, and then we have the auth data, which gives us the user ID and the user role. And that is coming from these guys here, which we attach here. Now let's go ahead and see a scenario where we have multiple middleware, so that after execution, the first middleware can call next for the next middleware to execute, etc. So far what we have is that we have only one middleware. So when next is called, that goes to the route handler and we send the response. For this, I'm going to implement row middleware. I'll come over here and say row.js. Like before, I'm going to export const row to be equal to that request response next. And the logic is simple. Because we have already attached the user information, authenticated user information, including the row, as we can see here, the row in that request object, we can access it in the next middleware. What that means is this. Let me have has required row to be equal to request.auth data dot row equals, for now I will hardcode this. I'm going to change it in a moment. So we have access to that, like we have seen with the console.log over here. We have access to that information in the request object. Then if not has required row, we do something similar. We return res.status, this time 403, and then .json. Let's send a message, message access denied. However, if the person has the required row, we proceed to the next middleware or route handler. Then for the hard-coded value here, it doesn't make sense to hard-code something like this. Otherwise, we need to write one middleware for each row. What we want is a way to pass additional parameter to our middleware function. To do that, all we need to do is, let me just cut this function. I will cut it. So what I want to do is to have another function that will just return the middleware function. So we say return, I will paste what I've copied, right? This is our middleware function. Here we can pass parameter the row name. Let me call it row name. And down here we compare to the row name. Then how do we apply this kind of middleware that has a parameter? I will go back to this users route. Then I will call the second middleware, that is row. Make sure to import that. But this expects a parameter, so we just do it a function call. For example, let's say this requires a user with admin role. This is how we can call it. We separate the middleware with comma, middleware functions. You can also you can also put them in an array. But what is important is the order you place them. we want the auth middleware to run first so it can attach additional information about the authenticated user to request object, which we then access in the role middleware to check whether the user has the required role. If we put the role middleware before the auth middleware, then our logic will break. Let me go back to Postman and send the request one more time. I will send this request, everything still works, right? Because this user has the role admin. Let's try with a user that doesn't have admin role. For that, I will go back to login and I think Hydro Tama, username Tama. So this user has the role user with this little expo here. I will go back now and let me copy the token. So I got a new token, copy it over to this place. I will send the request. You can see that we have access denied. This is coming from role middleware. To prove that, of course, we have seen the 403 and the message, but just to make it clear, I'm going to leave only auth middleware. Because this user is authenticated, there will be no issue. I will send the request, we get the list of users. But because we're also checking role now with role middleware, and the user has user role, if I send the request, we get access denied. And we can also see from the console that this user has role user, but that route requires admin user. Recall that to hand over to the next middleware in the series of middlewares, we need to call this next function. What happens when we don't call it? Similar thing to route handler, where if we don't call any of the res function, we are going to get stuck. What that means is if I send this request, the request stays hanging because we did not terminate the request response cycle and we did not hand over to the next middleware in the stack. Let me cancel this. So either either this is terminated here or we have to call next so it proceeds to the next handler. So far, we have applied the middlewares to this route, the user's route. But what if we want to apply the same middleware to many routes, maybe 500, 1,000 routes? It's going to be tedious work to try to apply to each one of them. Someone might even forget to apply an important middleware to a route, like an auth middleware. For that, in Express, we can apply middleware globally to all the routes or to a group of routes. I'm going to demonstrate both of them. First, let's see how to apply to group of routes. For that, I want all the user's route to be protected route. That means the user must be authenticated. Because right now, if I go to find one user, this is the auth tab, and this is the request header. There is no authentication token applied, but I can still access the user information. What we can do is to manually apply to this route, or we apply to the group of routes handled by this router. So for that, I can simply say router.use, and we specify the middleware we want this router to use, and that is auth. I can come here and remove this guy. I will save the code, and I will go back to try to get the user again. You can see that our authentication middleware kicks in. But this only applies to users route, because if I go to something like privacy policy, we can access the privacy policy without any authentication token. Then let's see how to apply globally the auth middleware. I can comment this out or leave it like that. What I want to do is to go to app.js. Here I want to say app, let me come up here, app.use auth. Make sure to import the auth middleware. So this is going to apply to all routes in the application. Let me go and try to access the privacy policy again. You can see that the auth middleware kicks in, right? But for this request to users route that already has a token, we can access, of course, access denied is coming from row middleware. Let me use a user that has hydro. This is admin. Okay, the problem with the approach I just did is that even the login URL is affected. But you get the point. If you have a middleware that you want to apply globally, you can apply like this. On the other hand, you can apply to group of routes. Okay guys, this brings us to the end of this lesson on middleware. I hope it makes sense. See you in the next lesson.